They didn't just build an empire, they built a war machine. The Romans laid roads that still survive, shaped laws that still govern us. And on the battlefield, they redefined what it meant to fight. These weren't just soldiers, they were thinkers, engineers, and masters of fear. Their enemies didn't just lose, they were broken. The Roman army was built on discipline, precision, and terror. Every movement had purpose, every formation a meaning. They didn't fight harder, they fought smarter. And sometimes their tactics were so shocking, so brutal, that they erased entire armies from history. Today we're diving into the wildest battle tactics that made the Roman army one of the most feared forces the world has ever seen. They called it testudo, which means tortoise in Latin. Imagine rows of soldiers marching forward in perfect harmony. Their shields locked so tight that not even a drop of rain can slip through. Shields in front, shields on top, shields on the sides. From a distance, it looked like a living fortress, a creature of metal and muscle crawling across the battlefield. Archers could shoot for hours and accomplish nothing. Arrows, shattered spears glanced away, even burning oil and stones were useless. The enemy would stand on the walls watching in disbelief as this slow, unstoppable wall crept closer. Then when the Romans were close enough, the formation broke open. Swords flashed, chaos followed. The testudo wasn't just protection, it was psychological warfare. It told the enemy, we are coming and there's nothing you can do. Commanders used it mostly during sieges, when soldiers had to cross open ground under a storm of arrows. It let them march straight to the city walls almost untouched. Some versions were so strong that they could carry wagons or even siege towers on top. Imagine that a human tank supporting another machine of war above it. But it had limits. It was slow, and if the enemy got too close, the soldiers inside could barely swing their swords. Cavalry charges or attacks from the flanks could break it. Still, the testudo remained one of the most intimidating sights any army could face. When the testudo wasn't enough, the Romans had another trick, one that combined patience, intelligence, and rhythm. They called it the triplex aces, the triple line. It wasn't just about having more men, it was about how they moved. Imagine a massive battlefield. The dust rises, commanders shout orders, and thousands of soldiers take their positions like chess pieces. 3 layers deep, each one waiting for its turn to strike. At the front stood the hastati, young and hungry for glory. Behind them, the principes, experienced and seasoned. And at the back, the triarii, the veterans calm as stone, waiting for the right moment. The Romans even had a saying, it has come to the triarii. It meant the situation was desperate but not hopeless. Because even in their worst moments, Rome had one more card to play. The battle began with the velites, the light troops rushing forward to throw javelins and harass the enemy before retreating. Then the hastati advanced to clash head-on. If they couldn't break through, they pulled back through the gaps, reforming behind the principes. Then the second line took over, pushing forward while the first recovered. Finally, if all else failed, the triarii moved in for the kill. The system ran like clockwork. One line fought while another rested. The enemy never got a break. You'd think you'd beaten them, only for fresh troops to step forward with the same cold precision. That's what made this formation terrifying. It never stopped coming. It worked on plains, hills, even forests, because the Romans didn't depend on numbers or luck. They relied on order. It was like watching gears turning inside a machine, each soldier just one part of something far greater. And once that machine started moving, there was no stopping it. Sometimes, though, Rome didn't want patience. They wanted shock. That's where the cuneus, the wedge, came in. Picture a triangle of men, the strongest and most skilled, forming the tip, the rest pressing in tight behind them. When the signal came, the entire formation surged forward like a spear made of flesh and steel. Its goal was simple: split the enemy line wide open. When the wedge hit, it was like a hammer blow. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, Roman wedges smashed the proud Macedonian phalanx, the same formation that had once conquered the world under Alexander. Centuries later at Watling Street, a Roman wedge tore through Boudicca's massive army, even though the Romans were heavily outnumbered. One concentrated push a break in the line, and suddenly panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers who had stood shoulder to shoulder now found themselves cut off, surrounded, and collapsing inward. Most armies relied on long, flat lines and brute strength. Rome used geometry and precision. The wedge ignored the idea of fighting everywhere at once. It focused all its power on one single point. And once that point cracked, the rest of the army followed like dominoes. To the men facing it, it must have looked unreal. One moment you're holding the line, and the next a wall of shields is ripping through your ranks unstoppable. It wasn't just a battle tactic, it was a psychological weapon. Even at sea, Roman creativity refused to stop. When they first went up against Carthage during the Punic Wars, they had almost no experience with naval warfare. Carthage ruled the Mediterranean with sleek, fast ships and elite sailors. Rome. They were land fighters, so they turned the sea into land. Their secret weapon was the Corvus, Latin for raven. Imagine a massive wooden plank attached to the front of a Roman ship with a giant iron spike underneath. When two ships drew close, the Romans dropped the plank. The spike slammed into the enemy deck, locking the ships together like claws. Suddenly, what was supposed to be a naval battle turned into a brutal infantry fight. Roman soldiers stormed across the plank with shields raised and swords drawn. Carthaginian sailors, who relied on speed and maneuvering, were trapped in close combat, the one place where the Romans always dominated. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, this tactic helped capture 30 Carthaginian ships. 2 years later at Ecnomus, it destroyed more than 90. For a brief moment, Rome controlled the sea not by sailing better, but by fighting differently. The Corvus wasn't perfect. It was heavy and made ships unstable in rough waters, but its impact was undeniable. It proved that Rome didn't need to master the sea to own it. They just needed to change the rules. And when strength wasn't enough, Rome turned to deception. One of their most dangerous tactics looked like defeat. It was called the feigned retreat. At first glance, it seemed simple soldiers pretending to panic and flee, inviting the enemy to chase them. But it required absolute discipline. You had to act like you were running for your life without actually losing formation. The moment the pursuers broke ranks thinking they had won, the Romans would suddenly turn reform and counterattack. That's when victory flipped. Enemies who thought they were hunting now found themselves hunted. Rome first saw this trick used against them in 262 BC near Agrigentum, when the Carthaginian commander Hanno ordered his cavalry to fake a retreat. The Roman horsemen took the bait, charging straight into an ambush. They were slaughtered, but Rome learns fast. Soon they began using the same trick themselves, turning enemy pride into panic. This tactic wasn't about muscle, it was about psychology. It made opponents believe they were moments from triumph, only to collapse into chaos. Rome's greatest weapon wasn't always the sword, it was control. Control of movement, control of emotion, control of fear. Rome's genius didn't stop at strategy or weapons. It extended to entire cities built and destroyed with mathematical precision. The most breathtaking example came in 52 BC at a place called Alesia. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix had taken refuge on a fortified hilltop surrounded by tens of thousands of warriors. Any normal general would have attacked the walls, but Julius Caesar wasn't normal. Instead of storming the fortress, he built another one around it. He ordered his legions to encircle Alesia, completely cutting off every path in or out. They dug trenches, built towers, and raised wooden palisades until the whole town sat trapped inside a ring of death. This outer wall, called a circumvallation, stretched more than 16 kilometers, an entire city of fortifications, built just to keep an enemy locked in. And Caesar didn't stop there. He knew Gallic reinforcements would eventually come, so he built a second wall facing the opposite direction. Now the Romans stood between two enemies, the besieged Gauls inside and the relief army outside. It was a masterpiece of engineering and cruelty. Ditches filled with water pits lined with sharpened stakes, hidden traps ready to impale charging men or horses. The ground itself became a weapon. When the relief force finally arrived, they found their countrymen screaming on the inside, Romans firing arrows from towers, and an unbreakable ring of walls that stretched to the horizon. The Gauls attacked from both sides at once, but Caesar's double wall held firm. When the dust settled, Vercingetorix surrendered. Rome didn't just defeat him, they buried an entire nation's hope under layers of earth and wood. The brilliance of Alesia wasn't just its construction, it was the psychology. The Gauls realized they weren't fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting architects of despair. But even Rome met monsters it didn't expect. Across ancient battlefields, armies began using war elephants, massive beasts that thundered forward like living tanks. To most soldiers, they were unstoppable tusks, armored in bronze bodies wrapped in leather eyes red with rage. When elephants charged, they crushed everything in their path. But Rome has always adapted. They learned never to meet elephants head-on. Instead, Soldiers opened narrow gaps in their formations, letting the beast charge straight through harmlessly. Once past, the Romans struck from the sides and rear, targeting legs and eyes. They discovered that even the strongest animal had weak spots. Sometimes they dug trenches or planted sharpened stakes to break the charge before it began. Then came one of the strangest Roman inventions of all time: fire pigs. Actual pigs covered in flammable tar set ablaze and released toward enemy elephants. The sight, sound, and smell of screaming, burning animals drove the elephants into panic. They bolted, trampling their own men, turning entire battle lines into chaos. It was horrific, yes, but effective. The Romans didn't care how it looked, they cared that it worked. Two great victories proved these tactics right. At Beneventum in 275 BC, the Romans turned Pyrrhus's elephants against him using side attacks and open passages. He won the day, but lost too many soldiers, famously saying, "Another victory like this and I am finished." At Zama in 212 BC, Scipio Africanus left deliberate gaps in his lines. When Hannibal's elephants charged, they barreled harmlessly through, crashing back into their own army. Rome learned to turn fear itself into a weapon. But sometimes the terror didn't come from the enemy, it came from within. To keep absolute discipline, Rome enforced a punishment so brutal that it still shocks historians today: decimation. When a unit disobeyed orders, deserted, or showed cowardice, every 10th man was executed by his own comrades. The soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The unlucky one fell to his knees as the other 9 beat him to death with clubs or stabbed him with daggers. No one was spared, no matter how brave or loyal. Afterwards, the survivors were punished further, given half rations, forced to sleep outside the camp, branded with shame. It was psychological warfare turned inward. The message was clear: better to die facing the enemy than to anger Rome. It wasn't used often, but when it was, it left scars that lasted for generations. During the Third Servile War, after a humiliating defeat against Spartacus, General Crassus ordered a decimation. Hundreds of men were killed by their own brothers in arms. Mark Antony used it again years later after his disastrous campaign in Media. Even in the early Republic, commanders like Appius Claudius resorted to it to crush rebellion. The thought alone kept soldiers in line. To fight Rome was terrifying, but to disappoint Rome was worse. That's what made their legions unstoppable. Not just their weapons or formations, but the unbreakable discipline that welded thousands of men into one mind. The enemy feared Roman steel, but Romans feared failure. That balance of terror, outward and inward, was the true secret of their empire. Every tactic, every punishment, every victory carried the same lesson order above all. From the testudo to the triplex aces, from the Corvus on the seas to the walls of Alesia, everything Rome touched was designed to control chaos. Even death became a tool for structure, and yet beneath the glory, you can almost hear the echo of exhaustion, the endless rhythm of marching feet, the clang of armor, the quiet knowledge that discipline came at a price. The Roman army didn't just conquer the world, it conquered the men who served it. Which of these tactics would have terrified you the most? The living wall that never stopped the double fortress at Alesia, or the punishment that made men fear their own friends? The Romans mastered war not through mercy, but through mind. Their legacy still whispers through every strategy book, every military academy, every empire that tries to rise again. Because Rome understood one thing above all: fear wins wars longer than swords ever could. The story of the Roman army isn't just about battles, it's about evolution. Over centuries, they transformed from a collection of citizen militias into a professional killing force, and that transformation reshaped the world. Every tactic they created came from trial and failure, from blood and observation. They learned from everyone they fought: Greeks, Carthaginians, Persians, and made those lessons their own. At first, their power came from unity. Legionnaires fought not for glory, but for order. They trusted the man beside them more than they trusted the gods. That trust built a rhythm that conquered continents. You can almost picture it: a sea of red shields advancing in perfect sync, the earth trembling under their boots, the sun reflecting off their armor like fire. To their enemies, it wasn't just an army, it was a force of nature. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Romans were human. Pride led them into traps, ambition into ruin. Entire legions vanished in deserts and forests they didn't understand. But even those defeats became lessons. They learned how to survive where others perished. They learned that control, not chaos, wins wars. What made Rome unique wasn't the size of its army, but its ability to adapt. When barbarian tribes fought with fury, Rome answered with structure. When clever enemies relied on deception, Rome countered with discipline. When the world changed, Rome changed with it. That's why their legacy still shapes every army on Earth. Think about modern soldiers, training formations, ranks. Logistics, it all traces back to Rome. The way we march, the way we organize command, even the language of war still echoes Latin roots. Words like legion, cohort, centurion, they weren't just titles, they were systems. Systems so efficient that even empires born centuries later copied them. But behind all that glory was a darker truth. The same order that made Rome powerful also made it cold. Soldiers became numbers. Victory became routine. The empire's strength depended on obedience so absolute that it crushed individuality. The legions that once fought for the Republic eventually fought for whoever paid them most. Discipline turned into control. Patriotism turned into politics. You can feel that shift in the stories of their greatest general, Caesar, crossing the Rubicon. Augustus building the first permanent army emperors, using legions to seize power from each other. The same system that conquered the world eventually consumed itself. Rome became a machine that couldn't stop moving forward, even when there was nowhere left to go. Still, there's a strange beauty in that tragedy. The Roman army showed humanity at its most disciplined and its most ruthless. Every tactic, every wall wedge. And deception was built on one truth: people can be trained to act as one mind. It's terrifying, but it's genius. And maybe that's why we still talk about it. They remind us of what happens when order is pushed to its limit, when victory becomes habit, when fear becomes policy. The Roman army didn't just win wars. It built the blueprint for empires and the warning for everyone that followed. Their walls still stand. Their roads still carry travelers. Their strategies are still studied. But the spirit that drove them, that mix of discipline, arrogance, and brilliance, feels both alien and familiar. Because deep down, every civilization that rises wants to believe it can last forever. Rome tried. For centuries it did. And then, like every empire before and after it fell, not because of a single battle, but because of exhaustion. The same system that made it unstoppable made it inflexible. The legions that once built the empire could no longer save it. But even in ruin, Rome left a message carved into history: strength fades, but structure endures. Their tactics weren't just about war, they were about control. Psychology and survival. From the testudo that advanced like a wall to the Corvus that turned sea battles into land wars, every invention told the same story: adapt or die. So when you look at the world today, at armies, nations, even corporations, you'll still see Rome's shadow. The discipline, the hierarchy, the obsession with order, it's all there, echoing across 2,000 years. The Romans are gone, but their methods remain. That's the paradox of their empire. They lost everything, yet still rule the modern world in silence. The Roman army was more than an institution, it was a philosophy. One that believed chaos could always be conquered by structure. And for a while they were right. So the next time you see a parade of soldiers marching in step, or read about a strategy that values discipline over emotion, remember where it came from. Remember the legions who built walls across Europe, who fought in deserts and mountains, who turned battle into art and obedience into law. They weren't gods. They were men who believed that order could defeat chaos, and for a time it did. But in the end, every empire meets its desert. Every army finds its limit. The Romans may have vanished, but their lesson never will. History remembers not just their victories, but their design. Because long after the banners fall and the swords rust away, their greatest creation endures the idea that power, once mastered, must always be controlled.